very dense way going over the last 15 years, how we have been shaping the world in the last 15 years, and then carry it forward or fast forward the next 15 years where I believe there are tremendous opportunities for leadership and for change. So, the last 15 years first. Until about 2007, the world enjoyed about a decade or a little bit more of economic growth that we had never known before. The US grew, Europe grew, you know those figures. You know the growth figures in Asia, 10% on average in China, very similar in other Asian countries. Latin America grew 6–7% per annum during that decade until 2007. Even Africa grew at the rate of 5%, which was, quite frankly, a great surprise, a very positive surprise, because we need to help that continent. Then came, with this growth, the opportunity to lead millions out of poverty. And we were successful in that, in Africa, in Latin America, and in Asia. In Asia, we created a new participation in a global middle class, with 300 million Chinese, 200 million in India, 500 million in total coming out of poverty and moving into a new middle global class. And I will come back to that, because that has a definitive impact on the world towards the future. After these 10 years, up until 2007, if a Martian had been sitting on the edge of Mars looking down at Earth, he probably could have said something like, interesting what Homo sapiens has finally organized on planet Earth. They have put a giant factory around China in Asia. They have a giant consumer in the US. And in the middle, everybody is doing business and making money. And that's what those 10 years were all about. Then came the crisis in 2008, and until the present, because we still haven't come out of it. We resurrected Keynes, because we thought that we would spend our way out of the crisis. That has left us with fiscal deficits of a magnitude of about 10% in the developed world. When I was in government in Costa Rica in the last century, 94 to 98, if we dared begin to have a fiscal deficit of almost 3% of GDP, we would have the World Bank, the IMF, the Inter-American Development Bank, CEPAL, ECLAC, everybody on our case. How dare we have a deficit of 3%? And today, we have about a 10% deficit in the States, an average of about that here in Europe. Economists have been describing the crisis since 2007, and I'm sure you read them as much as I do. And we've seen how they describe not only the crisis, but some opportunities to get out of it. Some say this is a V-shaped crisis, because the way we came in, we're then going to come out. Others say this is a U-shaped crisis. Still other economists say this is a W, because we're going to have a double dip recession. And I read an economist about 2 or 3 weeks ago that actually said that the crisis and coming out of it actually looked like the symbol of a square root. Down into the crisis, out, and then slow growth. The conclusion that I arrived when I read that article was that economists have run out of the letters of the alphabet to describe the crisis, and we're now into the symbol stage. But nevertheless, for all it's worth, my conclusion is that we are being harnessed here as a result of these years with 2 conditions. One is fiscal deficits of an order and magnitude that are important in national accounts and that we're going to have to solve towards the future. And the second one, and more worrisome one, is the rate of unemployment that we have in the world today as a result of this financial crisis. 8.1% in the US, 10.7% average in Europe. In Spain, 24%. Amongst your generation, 42%. In my country, almost 8%. Here, 14% in Lithuania, but more than double that amongst your generation. And that, amigas y amigos, is quite frankly not, eso no es de recibo, as we say in Spanish. That's not admissible. It's not admissible that in a world like the world we have today, with all of the technology that we have developed on the one side and all of the economic wherewithal that we have on the other side, we can't get our act together to solve the issues of unemployment. These are generations that have gone to school with a tremendous amount of sacrifice on their own part, that of their families, are coming out into the labor force to find that there's no opportunity for it. Eso no se vale. That is a tremendous injustice. And that cannot be one of the consequences of this crisis in which we still are. I worry myself with the fact that I see political leadership around the world more or less submitting plans to come out of the crisis that are más de lo mismo, more of the same. And in a way, I feel that they are all going through the motions and rearranging the chairs on the deck of the Titanic. And I say that because I don't see any imagination and I don't see any innovation in what is being proposed to get out of the crisis. I say that also because I believe that if we scratch the surface and look at where we are today, we will come to the conclusion that there are at least 3 profound structural changes in the world that we need to address if we're going to come out of this crisis creating the jobs and the opportunities for well-being that so many people around the world deserve and that we need to create. So let me mention these 3 profound structural changes. And by the way, I mention them because it is my belief that for the first time in the history of humanity, we are having to cope with them. Never before did we have to face up to these 3 structural challenges. The first one is the growing needs of the global population versus a planet with limits and boundaries. It took us 10,000 generations to come up to 1 billion people around the year 1825. Then in only 100 years, by 1925, we went to 2 billion. 75 years later, we were up to 6. Today, we're up to 7. And some people say that by 2050, we'll be 9 billion people on the face of the planet. Bob Zoellick has just stepped down from the World Bank. If he was here with us today and we asked, Bob, paint us a scenario where the World Bank could declare victory, close shop, and go home, he would probably say something like, well, that's a world where 1 billion people, of which we belong to, or rather, that's a world where 6 billion people have the possibilities to live like 1 billion of us, of which we belong to, already do. And that is a just aspiration in terms of development and well-beings for so many people around the world. The question is, however, how do we get there? As an example, China became the first market for the sale of automobiles 3 years ago. At that point in time, there were 140 vehicles per 1,000 Chinese. In the US, there are 920 vehicles per 1,000 Americans, and in Europe, on average, 620 vehicles per 1,000 Europeans. Now, if the model of transportation towards the future is what we see in the United States, and we have China coming up with 1.4 billion, and behind that India, clearly we need another 4 planets for the steel, the oil, the aluminum, and everything else that goes into the present way of manufacturing vehicles. So for the first time, we're up against the cognizance of what I call planetary limits. The second structural transformation is with respect to our energy matrix. We are an energy-hungry planet. In the last 20 years, supply of energy has migrated from mainly the OECD countries towards geographies that are rather unstable. So instead of OECD, we have our oil supplies and energy supplies coming from Russia, from the Middle East, from Africa, and from Venezuela, amongst other countries in Latin America. And you have the extraction process that was led by international corporations, whether we like them or not, that's another discussion, but that have good governance and that is some way regulated, towards a situation today where most of the extraction is being made by, if I can speak louder, to a situation today where most of the extraction is being done by para-state companies in some of these geographies. Clearly, there's an increasing propensity for energy to be used as an instrument of policy, as an instrument of geopolitics. And I don't need to remind Lithuania what it means to face an energy challenge, which is not only an energy challenge, but depends on geopolitical considerations. Today, supply and demand of oil is about 87 billion barrels per day, at equilibrium. Many say that the world has no capacity to pump more than 90 billion barrels per day. An increase in economic activity in Asia, for China to resume its growth that is now down to 7.6%, up to 10 again, and for India to resume its growth pattern, would easily go beyond the 90 billion barrel per day limit that we have with respect to extraction, and think of what prices would do in those considerations. The third structural profound change that we face is our environment. And energy has a lot to do with it, because carbon emissions coming from energy are 70% of the total of emissions. So most of you know the figures much better than I do. Climate change is not something of the future, it is here. The Uppsala Glacier in Argentina retreats 200 meters per year. The Arctic Circle is shrinking on a yearly basis. The glaciers in Asia that provide 50% of the drinking water to 40% of the world's population are also retrenching. And to the month of March of this year, the record of high temperatures in places around the world compared to the record of low temperatures was 30-1. Clearly, climate change is here. Yes, there is the dissenting voice, which is good because it makes us revise our facts, but over 4,000 scientists signed the last IPCC report. Climate change is here. Math does not lie. We have 400 parts per million in the atmosphere, 400 parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere today. We are emitting about 3 parts per million per year. So 90 years to the end of the century is 270 plus 400, 670. 670. Scientists say that we should not surpass 450 parts per million if we don't want to go over 2 or minus, if we don't want to go over or minus 2 degrees centigrade. And the track that we're on amigas and amigos. This track that we're on to have over 600 parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere by the end of the century is a track that would give us changes of plus minus 5 degrees centigrades. So the last time the Earth had plus 5 degrees centigrades was about 3 million years ago, and alligators were swimming in the North Pole. And the last time we had minus 5 degrees centigrades was only about 10,000 years ago at the end of the Ice Age. Clearly, that is neither the scenario that we want towards the future. These three structural transformations, I say again, I believe are relatively new, or for the first time encountered by all of us on this planet. And so, in a nutshell, that is a planet we have shaped. Welcome to it. Now let's think of a planet you can shape towards the future. Because there are tremendous opportunities to reset the button and reboot development around the world. And it will require leadership, and it will require a tremendous amount of work. And that is what you're called to do. And that is a great opportunity that you have before you. Instead of trying to come out of the crisis with business as usual, what we should be doing is redirecting our global development style towards a low-carbon economy. Something completely different that would create the jobs that we need for the new generations, that would create tremendous opportunities for entrepreneurs, new business models, and that in a nutshell will allow us to reinvent everything. Reset the button, reinvent everything. The way we transport ourselves, the way we live, the way we work, the way we interact in society. That different course towards a low-carbon economy is where many of us see the opportunities. That is a course, amigas y amigos, in that I don't expect a lot of enlightened leadership to come from governments. But I do expect action to come from civil society, from the business community, from universities, from global NGOs that have been talking about this for many, many years. It's a great opportunity to move forward. And that's what we're doing at the Carbon War Room. The name comes from a play on words. They say that at the outset of World War II, Churchill said he needed to establish a war room to win the war. A place that would concentrate information flows and help decision-making processes. The Carbon War Room is a Sir Richard Branson, Vladas Lasas, and 6 other global entrepreneur idea to set up an organization that helps in finding pathways towards the low-carbon economy. We scope out sectors of the global economy in where we can achieve carbon emission reductions, making it a good business opportunity for entrepreneurs and for job creation, and where we don't depend on governments or intergovernmental processes or agreements to be able to move forward with what we're doing. So let me give you some examples of what we're already up to. And by the way, we were established at the end of 2009, so we're a young organization. Take the shipping industry. There's 100,000 ships out there sailing the oceans of the world. Of those 100,000 ships, about 75,000 are overfishing. We're depleting our fisheries. But that's a different story for the next youth forum here in Lithuania. The 25,000 larger ships have combined total emissions equivalent to those of the 6th largest emitting nation. So the emissions of those vessels are equivalent to a country between Japan and Germany. You take those ships, You put them out upon a dry dock. Dry docks are usually in economically depressed areas, so we begin creating jobs. You deploy proven technologies to the tune of $2–3 million per ship. So you're purchasing technologies and software and hardware from companies that have been established by entrepreneurs who are coming out with new products that have already been proven. And you roll that ship off the dry dock 6 to 8 weeks later, consuming between 20 and 30% less energy. That's 20 to 30% less carbon emissions. The global fuel bill that can be saved is $70 billion per year. The payback, the return on investment of deploying these technologies on the ships is 36 months. If you paint the hull of these ships with new modern type paints, you reduce the coefficient of drag by 10%. By 10%. That investment itself pays off in 10 months. Let me go to a second example, which is very relevant, I think, to Lithuania and to my country as well. So it turns out, as you know, that over 50% of the world's population is now living in cities. And many of our cities have old buildings from other times and other eras, constructed when we weren't as cognizant that we were a boundary-type planet and that we would have energy supply challenges towards the future. As a result, many of these buildings are energy inefficient. In these buildings you have motors, pumps, compressors, heating, air conditioning, light fixtures, you name it, they have it. So the potential there is to reduce energy consumption in buildings by between 20 and 25%. Last September, after studying this for about a year, we launched a consortium comprised of the following. An engineering company that comes into the building, looks at your lighting, looks at your fixtures, looks at your plumbing, looks at your air conditioning and heating, and says, if we retrofit this building, we can save 25% of energy. After the engineering company comes in, you have an insurance company that comes in. And that insurance company reviews what the engineering company has done, and if it's correct, says, I'm willing to write an insurance policy that, in effect, this reduction of energy consumption can be achieved. So if you don't assume it, the insurance company pays. With that, you have a bank that comes in and is willing to finance the retrofitting that is going to be paid out of the savings. And after that, the companies that are going to do the actual work in the buildings, they roll up to these buildings. Men and women get out in white overalls and start working. So in this consortium that we launched last September, the engineering company is Lockheed Martin. The insurance company is Energi, underwritten by Hanover Re. The bank is Barclays. And then you have the insurance companies, and then you have the companies that come in to do the retrofitting. That consortium was launched with an initial investment of $650 million to start retrofitting buildings in Miami and Sacramento. Now, Lithuania has a good amount of buildings that were created before your recovery of democracy. In the time of Russian occupation, those buildings are tremendously energy inefficient. Those buildings represent a potential of 30 to 40% energy savings, which is 30 or 40% less energy that you have to import from your neighbor, which is job creation to retrofit those buildings, which is opportunities for entrepreneurs to create new software programs through which they can remotely control the energy matrix of these buildings, which reactivates the economy, which gets us going again and brings down that unemployment rate of 14% which we have. Third and final example. Douglas and myself are just coming back 2 or 3 weeks ago from Rio +20. There we signed an MOU, a Memorandum of Understanding with the government of Aruba to take Aruba off fossil fuels and put them on a track of 100% renewables. So island nations like Aruba and so many in the Pacific and around the world today are paying between 30 cents US cents and $1.20 per kilowatt hour. That is, I'm sorry, between 50 cents and $1.20 per kilowatt hour. That is extremely expensive electricity. And it has that price because it's fossil fuel based, oil or coal brought in small barges, in inefficient ways, to be burned in old generators that bring up cost and also, by the way, contaminate the planet with our carbon emissions. Against that, wind and solar are already competitive today, without any need for government subsidies, without any need for special programs. Why not then create out of Aruba an example and something that can be scalable and replicable to take to other islands around the nation, around the world, take them off fossil fuels and onto renewables. And that is, again, another tremendous opportunity for employment and for entrepreneurship, for development of new technologies, and for creating a different kind of economy than the economy that the world has today. So in a nutshell, amigas y amigos, if it seems like we are leaving you somewhat of a mess, as I have mentioned from the first 15 years or the last 15 years, yes, it has its good things. It also has its bad things. Perhaps we haven't done the best, but that's where it is. But that does not necessarily have to be the future. The future is yours. A low-carbon economy is around the corner. We have most of the technology. We have the economic wherewithal. And we have you to lead it. All of you know very well what the quest for democracy means. This country only recuperated its democracy 22 years ago. Your parents know even better than you do what it meant to live without democracy. So let me say that the equivalent of what the quest for democracy was to your parents is your quest for a sustainable planet. What they had to fight to obtain democracy is what we have to today put forward to obtain sustainability and the transition to a low-carbon economy. At the end of the day, the only component that is missing in this transition is you, is leadership. Every one of you can go back home after this is over and be a powerful agent of change, of moving things in a completely different direction. And every one of you should. Because unless we discover something else out there that we haven't yet, there is no planet B. We can go through life with a plan A or a plan B or a plan C. But at the end of the day, amigas y amigos, there is no planet B. This is our home. We have to clean it up. We have to get our act together. And we have to deploy the technology, the economy, the skills, the mindsets, the talents, and the leadership that we have to put it on the right course towards the future. Muchísimas gracias. Thank you. Some questions, and a question up there.
Hello. Costa Rica is country #1 in the world in HPI index, Health Planet Index, which means that people in Costa Rica are happiest and have highest life expectancy in comparison with consumption and environment output. That means that people in Costa Rica are happiest in comparison with consumption, right? And meanwhile, Lithuania is somewhere in the end of the list. And what lessons could Lithuania learn from Costa Rica in this matter? Thank you.
Well, I guess the answer to that question, how Costa Rica managed to be #1 on an index, really depends on who you ask. So if you ask my political opposition in Costa Rica, they'll say, it's easy. We send them to work outside, and we've been happy ever since. But on a more serious note, because I don't particularly agree with that definition, on a more serious note, I would say that Costa Rica has invested heavily over many years in creating an equilibrium between economic, social, and environmental issues. You know, we have no army. In 1948, after a revolution to restitute democracy in the country, we did away with the army constitutionally. And despite of the fact that Central America was the fighting ground of 60 years of Cold War, we, the only country without the army, was the only country that did not get into a conflict. So maybe there's a lesson there. The wars we need to fight towards the future are different wars than what we have fought in the past. The two big wars we need to fight is a war against poverty, because it's inexcusable with the economic wherewithal we have today that we continue to have poverty around the world as we do, and the war on climate change. And both those wars can be won by transitioning to the low-carbon economy. If you concentrate on your economics, but you also concentrate on your social issues and your environment, and we move towards a new definition of what development means, I think we'll be a happier planet. Next one. You think that some 3 million of us somehow doesn't matter. So, why to start? Good question. Why not start? Why not be a leader? Why do we have to put up with what the US and China do? This is a world in which we can make a difference. Differences are made by small groups of people that get motivated and get on to action. So in spite of what the US or China may be doing, it's time to lead, señoras y señores. And in leadership, it doesn't matter if you come from a small country or a medium country. But lead. Get up and lead. And by the way, China and India are doing a hell of a lot more than they would publicly announce. So if you read the last 5-year program of China put forward in April of last year, you will understand that they have signaled out the green economy and transitioning to low carbon as a comparative advantage to fast forward 25 years with respect of their development with respect to the West. Because they see that the West is not moving at the same speed, and they believe they can move faster. And if you look at what states are doing in the US and cities are doing in the US, I just announced here a minute ago $650 million going into the retrofitting of buildings in Miami and in Sacramento. If you look at what cities are doing and states are doing in the US, they're doing a hell of a lot more than their federal government is doing. So this is a time for action. And besides, if we don't want to do it for lower carbon emissions, do it for the business opportunity. Do it for the business opportunity. This is the greatest economic empowerment opportunity of our age. It's a complete transformation. Tremendous opportunity for entrepreneurs and for better livelihoods. Next question, please. As long as everybody is engaged in some kind of regular sport activity, be it gym or cycling, etc. A lot of energy is released during these activities. Can it be used? I'm sure it could, but it will take entrepreneurs to see how we're going to harness it. So there again, there's a tremendous opportunity in that as well. We're talking about budget and that countries are in debt, and debt is huge. As far as I know, all countries are in debt. Whom we owe the money to? Why to them? Great question. Would anybody here care to recognize himself as an economist and want to answer this? Okay. So, who do we owe this money to? Well, we owe it to ourselves and we owe it to other nations. I'm not going to get into that field. I'm just a lowly engineer. How do you actually define sustainability? What is the main factor when talking about sustainable development? 3 things to do now. Sustainability. I define sustainability as an intelligent bringing together of good macroeconomic policies with strategic investment in social aspects and a development style that is in peace with nature. To me, that's sustainability. Live off the interest and don't live off the principle. That's sustainability. We can all get it. We can all do it in the world of today. Main factors when talking about sustainable development. I think the main factors here are talking about our future. What is the kind of future that we want to build? What is the world in which we want to live in? What type of a society is a society that we aspire to live our lives in? Sustainability is all about those issues. And 3 things to do now. Well, to do now is, when you come out of here, number 1, think of how you can lower your own carbon footprint to begin with. Secondly, become an agent of change. Discuss these issues. Talk about them. Organize your community. Organize your neighborhood. There's a lot that can be done in this field. And third, think about opportunities for entrepreneurship in the change of the economy to a low carbon footprint. I think that's where the most potential is, and that is where we have to really move ahead. Not everything that we need is known, but certainly we have the technologies and a lot of economic wherewithal that we can already start moving ahead with that. Incidentally, speaking about that, just to single out an example. Yesterday I stopped in, I'm sorry for my lack of memory, the city right next to here where you're from, guys?
Kaunas.
Pardon me?
Kaunas.
Kaunas. So I stopped in to see this company there that is working on electric vehicles. Okay? Now that work on electric vehicles done in Kaunas, it's not being done by Media Lab, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Okay? It's not being done by Georgia Tech. Okay? It's being done by this guy right here. Stand up, please. So this guy right here has put together with Lithuanian components what did you call it? It's not the regulator. What is it, the thing that is more efficient than the Teslas?
Motor control.
Thank you. He's put together with Lithuanian components a motor controller for the electric vehicle that has a higher energy to weight ratio than the controller in the Tesla vehicle, which is the most advanced electric vehicle in the world today, produced in Silicon Valley, California. That's the example. And that is what we can do today.
Muchísimas gracias.